Okay, hi everyone. I'm hearing an echo, so I'm assuming the microphone's working and that you can hear me in the back. Thank you all for coming out here on the 1st of December. And thank you very much, Els, for the invitation and the warm welcome. So when Els reached out to me, I think it was in May or June, and she said, well, we would like you to come and talk about Donald Trump and geopolitics. And I said, why not? Because at the time, I was in the midst of Donald Trump. How are we reacting to Donald Trump? What's he doing in foreign policy? I was very much focused on how international lawyers are responding to Donald Trump. At the time, I was quite pregnant, and I said, well, Els, I'd like to come, but I'm going to actually be on maternity leave, but I'm sure it'll be fine. The baby will be 3 months old by then. No problem. I can do a talk. What I didn't know is that I would be completely disconnected from the world for about 3 months in my little bubble. And as you can imagine, a lot has happened over the past 3 months. The things that I was studying back in May or June, honestly, it's like that I have to remember that that actually happened. So I'm just saying that events have moved fast. It's hard to keep up, and I'm not going to lie, I didn't necessarily miss being disconnected. Right? So I think before we were talking about how we felt, I think if we feel overwhelmed, you just unplug your phone, your computer, whatever, and you'll immediately feel much better. So anyway, also that just allows me to have this caveat. If you have questions, I'm really happy to take them to have a discussion. I might be a bit fuzzy on the details, so in order to feel better, I have my computer here, which gives me a sense of security where I can quickly look something up, just in case. So that's basically me setting the background for this talk. Now, I do want to thank Els for, asking a few questions, getting a feel about, what's our impression of Trump, what was our reaction when he was elected, and I did like the answer about, it was the gentleman here on my right, and he was referring to, well, chaos, order, it's out of our control, and I think those are really key words that I'm going to come back to in a few slides. So I think also one thing to know is, well, who is a background or knowledge about international law? I see one, there we go. A few here, okay, in the front. And who has no knowledge of international law? Oh, okay. So if at one point I'm saying something that makes no sense or I'm going too fast, please interrupt me because my purpose here is to make sense, right? That's what I said. We'll see if I can deliver. So is Trump killing the international rules-based order? That was kind of the question. That's kind of what people said he's going to do. So since I'm a lawyer, we always want to clarify what we're talking about. So what is the international rules-based order? Do you all remember this phrase coming out a lot a couple years ago? Do some of you remember this? No? So it's a term that was used quite a bit when Russia invaded Ukraine almost 6 years ago. The US administration kept saying that Russia was breaching the rules-based order. And you see the EU affirming that we need to respect and uphold the rules-based order. But it's an ambiguous term, so let's look, well, I think it's useful to kind of clarify what it means and whether or not it constitutes international law. And then, in order to justify or to situate the context, is Trump killing international law or the rules-based order, whatever you want to call it? Well, first I think it's useful to kind of, for myself, to come up to speed, what is going on, what has happened. And I'm only going to use recent examples, so you might think of many others. I'm only going to use one, really, and then we'll just take it from there. And then we'll get into the crux, what is this thing, this Trump effect, what is this effect that he's having on us? And oftentimes when I say us, I guess it's this group I identify with, international lawyers. So, what is this thing called the rules-based order? It's generally understood as a synonym for international law. Now, international law constitutes a set of rules agreed upon among states, principally, about how to govern their affairs and their relations, right? So there's agreements that can be adopted in various forms, And these agreements create, expectations. We know how things are supposed to go. It creates some sort of predictability, right? And this also helps us manage this big group of actors. There's about, I don't remember if it's 194 states, 195, all have different interests, different objectives, but we like to think, well, they have one common objective. For example, if they're going to sign the Paris Agreement, it's they want to address climate change. They want to be able to ensure that we can do what we can to protect our climate. So they come together, they sign treaties, they hash out the details, and they make a commitment, right? And so for international lawyers, and the idea of international law is that it injects order into an otherwise chaotic society. So if you open an international law textbook, and there's usually going to be the introduction, and very often it's going to say, what are these grand goals of international law? Well, it's to ensure peaceful coexistence between states, because if we don't have rules, they're going to behave in unpredictable ways, they're going to fight. We don't want them to fight, but they're going to fight, but we have to have rules that will curb how they fight, for example. And so international lawyers are very committed to this idea that we have to have a world where there's order and where there's peaceful coexistence between states. And so they often see it as their role to contribute to this goal, either by clarifying what the rules are. Oftentimes there's disagreements between states on how to interpret these rules, either by stating when something is in conformity with international law, yes or no. So, when Russia invades Ukraine, it seems kind of obvious that that's an unlawful act, but you will have lots of articles explaining why this is a wrongful act, right? So we clarify, this doesn't stand, we're not allowed to do this. Sometimes there's a gap because the world evolves and international law hasn't had the time to catch up. We're seeing this quite a bit with the rise of artificial intelligence, or facial recognition technology. The world sometimes moves faster than the rules we have in place. So international lawyers, for example, if we have technology that may be undermining human rights, international lawyers like to flag this and say, wait a second, okay, there's this technology, but we have a commitment to human rights. There's something going on here that we need to pay attention to. So basically, for international lawyers, the law makes the world a better place. And I think that's the ideal, right? That's the goal. But I think for a lot of actors, and maybe we'll get to this, is it really about peaceful coexistence and these ideals that we have, such as justice and peace, or is it sometimes a way to maintain the status quo? Because sometimes there's always the winners and losers in this system. I think most of us, we live in the Netherlands. I live in Belgium, actually. And I would say we're pretty much the winners of the situation, but there's other groups of people out there that are very much the losers. So yes, we have human rights, but human rights, for example, do not apply to private actors, to corporations. So you have these corporations that, for example, are exploiting children to, take out minerals in mines, or they're having, forced labor in order to create their garments. Well, there's a lot of hashing out. There isn't really a concrete set of rules to govern the behavior of these corporations. So, and I'll get into more even when it comes to state relations. Sometimes international law is able to maintain systemic inequalities. So I think that's just something to bear in mind. So that order doesn't necessarily mean that it's order for everybody. And so where did the system that we refer to today as international law, where did it emerge from? So we're in 2025, and actually, I think what we would call like the multilateral order, so all these international organizations that exist, all these treaties, really went into high gear after World War II. And the United States of America played a very important part in creating this system. It basically was the biggest winner of World War II because the war had not been carried out on its territory. So yes, there are countries like Europe and France that participated in the creation of the systems that we have today, and Russia, but they were ravaged by the war. They were economically a lot weaker than the United States at the time. So the US was really the hegemon, And when you're a hegemon, when you're an authority, well, you're really able to shape rules in your favor, and really that are an expression of your worldview. And what we often see is when actors enjoy this position of authority, they create rules of exclusion as well. So they set up the system in order to exclude those actors that they view as a threat. So at the time, we just emerged from World War II, well, the big threat was fascism and Nazis. So the US wanted to create a system, with the participation of other actors, in order to ensure that we wouldn't have another Adolf Hitler come about, for example. So they really favored, the liberal principles that are very much under the underlying current of the international order. So, favoring democracy, human rights, prohibiting the use of force between states, ensuring that states solve their disputes peacefully. We also wanted to make sure that there was economic trade and that there would be economic growth. So we created organizations such as the World Trade Organization or the International Monetary Fund. So at the time when the US was creating this, I think is interesting, is that at the time the USSR wasn't so much of a concern because they thought, well, we fought on the same side, we won the war together, so we can be seen as allies. Afterwards, when the US started to fear communism, it started to progressively withdraw or not see it so much in its interests to support, for example, the United Nations, which gave a voice to all independent states and also where the USSR could have some influence. So the US started to be more favorable towards NATO, or sometimes having bilateral agreements with states, right? But the point here is to say that the US has played really a significant role in creating the system that we have today, and very often states, and I think this is very much the case of European states and the EU, look up to the US as the leader. So of course, if you have an authority, if you have a hegemon, you always have actors that have a lesser social status. I don't think that the EU or European states would like to acknowledge that maybe they have a lesser status than the US, but I think that kind of plays out in practice, especially when we go into shock because Donald Trump is elected. Oh my gosh, what is he going to do? Can we trust him? This is, I'm kind of skipping ahead, but can we trust him to uphold the system that we depend on, or is he going to completely destroy it? Now, of course, if we have that question, it's because we recognize the unique position that the United States has at the moment in the international system. All right. So that was very much about international law, and I want to go back to this term rules-based order because it's really something that, well, it was initially the question I think that was put to me. And it's something that the US really started to emphasize a lot when Russia invaded Ukraine. So much so, like every US official was repeating it, it really seemed like that was kind of like the slogan that they had to repeat. But then people started to wonder, okay, what actually is the rules-based order? Is it really a synonym for international law? And I think you could say so, yes. But it also has been, so this is I'm quoting here an article by John Dugard, who is a South African scholar. At one point he was an ad hoc judge, so he was a judge on the International Court of Justice. And so he said, well, actually the rules-based order is a phrase that allows the US to uphold its own role or its own self-image as, a leader and authority that defends and upholds a system while also pursuing its own national interests. So the thing with the United States of America is, well, it doesn't always participate in international agreements, even though it would actually, benefit, let's say, the international community if this actor would. So, for example, the U.S. ultimately did not sign the Rome Statute, which is the treaty that created the International Criminal Court, right? So that's the court that you've all heard of. It's been in the news quite a bit. That's in The Hague, and that prosecutes individuals who are suspected of having committed war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. The U.S. isn't party to this treaty. And yet, it often when it serves its interests, says, well, the states that are party to that treaty have to respect the treaty. We saw this when there was an arrest warrant issued against Vladimir Putin, that the US was reminding member states of their responsibility to arrest Putin if he would come on their territory. And yet, when the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants against Benjamin Netanyahu, the US invited Benjamin to the US territory, right? No concern. Of course, the US doesn't have the obligation to arrest him. The US has even gone further and sanctioned judges of the court who issued the arrest warrant. There was recently an article that came out by a judge explaining how he lives under these sanctions. He's basically completely cut off from the international financial system. So it's not so much that the US is telling countries to respect international law, but respect the rules-based order, which for some basically means the US makes up the rules and follows them when it likes to, yes or no, right? So that's why there's been some criticism about, okay, what's the rules-based order? What does it really mean? And that maybe we should be a bit more, of course it looks nice when you have a US official affirming the importance of what might be international law, but maybe there's a bit more to it than that. So that's just something I want to flag. I think also, again, the word order is interesting, right? So it's making sure that we live in time of certainty and predictability as opposed to being in a situation of chaos. Okay, so that's just kind of some background, kind of saying, okay, this is the United States of America. I don't think I've said anything, I don't think that's too unfamiliar to anybody, to be honest. So what's going on, or what has been going on? Well, this is the latest, I don't know, if anybody would talk about what's on their radar, or what's interesting to them if we think about Donald Trump's foreign policy, which I know changes, with the wind. But if there's any event lately that's of interest to somebody, or what's caught your attention? Venezuela? Okay. You? Honduras? Okay. Anybody else? Yes?
Wasn't there a Thanksgiving address in he mentioned that it was a street war migrants?
Okay, yeah, I think I saw a brief headline saying that he's indefinitely going to prohibit migration. But I don't know. I just saw a headline. I didn't read the story. Yeah? Third world country migrants, that's the word. I wasn't sure if I had remembered third world countries. I thought, was it third countries, so all countries, so it's just third world countries. Okay, all right. So he wants to prohibit third world countries from migrating to the US. Okay, so the first answer we got here was Venezuela. Well, the gentleman here in front and I think alike, because what indeed has caught my eye is all this stuff that's going around Venezuela. So I guess it was in September where there was the first report of the US targeting a boat that they said was involved in drug trafficking, and then there's been a series of drone strikes against these boats. It's not clear to me I don't think it's really been released, if these were actually individuals involved in drug trafficking or some of these were fishermen boats. And so these individuals are, in any event, they're being framed as drug traffickers, also as terrorists. And the US is starting to encircle Venezuela with highly sophisticated military technology. And people are saying, well, if this really is about catching, drug traffickers, you're basically trying to hit a fly with a blowtorch. Like, this is really, seems to be escalating tensions between the two countries. Because it's not just recently that there's tension between Venezuela and the US. In fact, it's been going on quite a bit. Almost for 10 years since Maduro came to power, and the US placed Venezuela under very heavy sanctions. And the reason that's given for them sanctioning Maduro is because he's violating human rights. And we hear this a lot, that he's a dictator. And that there was this whole battle for power between Maduro and Guaido. And the US was really backing Guaido, so much so that they sort of tried to have a coup, but that kind of failed. Anyway, despite the fact that the US has been very much against Maduro. He remains in power, and now it seems, so this is a policy that started already under Obama, and Donald Trump has steadily escalated it, so much so that now we're wondering if they're going to war. The interesting thing, I think, and so does anybody know the gentleman in black and white, Elliot Abrams? So he's been defined as a neocon. He was involved in the Iran-Contras affair, so it was when the US was funding rebel groups in Nicaragua covertly, and he was involved in organizing all that in secret. He was eventually pardoned for that by George W. Bush Sr., and then George W. Bush Jr. hired him as his strategic advisor for the Middle East. So he was active in the US invasion of Iraq in 2004. And then when Trump came to power, well, he nominated Elliot Abrams, as his specialist on Latin America. And so Elliot Abrams, this is a few days ago, wrote an article, How to Topple Maduro, and why regime change is the only way forward in Venezuela. So he's openly stating that the goal of any US attack is to basically cause regime change, which is contrary to international law, right? So if you go to war against a country, you're only allowed, the rules say, that you can only go to war in self-defense or if you've been authorized by the UN Security Council. So Venezuela has not attacked the United States, so self-defense wouldn't really work here. And of course, they don't have an authorization from the UN Security Council. Now, what the US has done in the past is it has used force against a state in response to acts of terrorism. We see this, and lately the US has listed a drug cartel as a terrorist organization. Okay, I don't know if eventually it will lead to something, but that's another illustration of the US's rules-based order, because it's very controversial under international law whether or not you can actually use force against terrorist groups. And actually the main actors that advocate for this are the US and their allies, right? Other countries in the world don't really want to get bombed because there may or may not be terrorist groups on their territory. If this would be allowed where I live in Belgium, well, there's been some terrorist actors that reside in Brussels, so then you think, well, Brussels could be the subject to drone strikes if we suspect that there's terrorists there and we think it's okay to extrajudicially kill people. Anyway, now Elliot Abrams and other individuals that are part of the Trump administration go to great lengths to explain that Maduro needs to go because he's a dictator and he is responsible for grave human rights violations. Now, you have Colombian President Gustavo Petro, who has basically said, well, no, the heart of US pressure on Venezuela is oil. It doesn't have to do about drugs, it has to do about oil. Okay. So he's Colombian, right? He's recently been sanctioned by the United States. So he's a head of state that's been sanctioned by the US because he criticized Donald Trump when he was in New York for the UN General Assembly. Now, the other person, so Gustavo point blank says, well, it's about oil. And you can always have this debate, well, is it really about oil? What I found interesting is it was back in October. So Ambassador James Story, he was the US ambassador to Venezuela until 2018. When Venezuela closed and the US, they have no more diplomatic relations, so then he left. So he was the last US ambassador in Venezuela. And he was recently interviewed by 60 Minutes, it's an American show, and they had the segment On the Brink on Venezuela. And James Story basically said about Nicolas Maduro, and I have if anybody wants the link, I can give you the link in the exact minute when he says it, because I had to go check it for myself to make sure that this wasn't just something somebody had made up. But what did he say? This is a very bad actor, speaking about President Maduro, sitting on top of the world's largest known oil reserves, plus the critical minerals that will fuel the 21st century economy, and he is in bed with our strategic competitors. This is a criminal organization masquerading as a government. So there's a few reasons given for why Maduro is bad, and he just happens to be sitting on a lot of oil and minerals. Okay. I think that was a bit of an interesting detail to add. Now, he said he's in bed with our strategic competitors. The interesting thing about that is Venezuela did indeed turn to countries like Iran and Russia because of the sanctions. So the problem with sanctions is that the more you sanction, the more the countries that are sanctioned, they kind of start to form alliances and start to work together. So it kind of, anyway, I'm going off topic there, sorry, but I just thought that was also an interesting remark. Anyway, and so this is about oil, and then there was an article in the New York Times, basically where Venezuela was making concessions to the US and offering US companies a stake in Venezuela's oil, saying we will give US companies, they can have the first contracts, right? And basically this was used as negotiation strategy, right? Don't invade us. We will, work along with the US, and, you guys can gain economically from our oil as well. And Donald Trump, in reaction to that, said he has offered everything because he doesn't want to around with the USA. Okay. So, again, and this isn't the only country where Donald Trump has said something about, I don't know if you remember, this was in 2009. So this isn't the only country where Donald Trump has been very interested in their oil fields. So the US actually, I don't know, who knows that the US has troops in Syria? Right? So the US has troops in Syria. We don't really talk about it that much. We don't know exactly how many troops are there. I think in the spring they announced that they were going to withdraw. But that was but this is in 2019. Again, you can easily find this clip on YouTube where, Donald Trump is saying about the troops in Syria, that they're still in Syria. We've withdrawn from Syria, except from the oil fields. We're keeping the oil. We have the oil is secure. We left all the troops behind only for the oil. So that's what Donald Trump said, which is very unusual for a head of state to say something like that, including for a US president. Don't usually say we have troops there for oil. That's usually something that's discussed by podcasters, not by sitting presidents. Now, another interesting, I think, development, so I'm kind of hopping along between countries. But last year, in December, so this article was published last year, actually. It was published in the Leiden Journal of International Law, and it's basically 3 scholars saying, okay, well, Gaza has gas that has not been developed, and of course this gas would be really great for the reconstruction of the Gaza Strip after all the devastation that it has endured. And so they say, well, it's not sure who actually has a claim to the gas. And that was what was extremely controversial, that they said that. Okay, so in their view, it's not sure who has a claim. And so we examined, there's 4 possible actors that could have a claim. And I just remembered, I think it's just interesting. So they, of course, refer to Palestine. They say, okay, perhaps continued Israeli occupation, but that's a bit, not a great solution. Or an international transition administration. So we set up some sort of international group of actors that will administer Gaza, and they will help Gaza develop, right? And I think that Donald Trump was quite interested in creating a Riviera over the Gaza Strip, which would be really beautiful. Donald Trump is also very proud that he was involved in brokering a ceasefire agreement and coming up with a plan, which was recently, endorsed by the UN Security Council. And what does that plan include? Well, it doesn't exactly, a board of peace and, an international stabilization force. Now, while this plan has been endorsed by the UN Security Council, Russia and China abstained, right? But all other member states, the other 13 member states, voted in favor. This resolution has been heavily criticized by human rights groups for undermining basically the Palestinian people's right to self-determination, which has been recognized by the International Court of Justice, and it's been criticized for basically putting the Gazan people under a system of trusteeship. So basically, through this resolution, it's kind of like we're going back into colonial times where there were some states that were not allowed to have access to independence, and they had to be put under some sort of form of international control. So, I mean, that's only, let's say, 3 examples of what's going on, right? And I think that's already quite a bit, but it's only a really segment of everything that we've been through in the past year. And I think, for example, this resolution, like I just said, okay, technically, it's adopted by the UN Security Council, heavily promoted by the US under President Trump. And I think even the resolution refers in the beginning to the fact that, President Donald Trump played a really significant part in making sure that this text was, drafted and agreed upon. Anyway, but again, like these actions really have a way of very much undermining what we would call, the international system and the rules-based order, if we consider that this rules-based order is indeed a synonym of international law. And it's open foreign policy, so much, that a lot of people are wondering, well, what is going on, right? And so you could say that international law is in a state of crisis because we have a very important actor that is undermining the system. I would like to say, however, that although it might be a bit counterintuitive, that international law generally really benefits from a crisis because it allows us international lawyers to come out and say, no, international law matters, you broke the rules. So if I assert what the rules are, and if I assert that you're breaking them, I'm still saying the rules exist. And so that's why somewhat counterintuitively, when Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, it was almost like international lawyers had revival. It feels really weird to be saying this, but this is a very weird thing I'm about to say. But that's kind of the atmosphere was, yes, international law matters because the US and the EU heavily sanctioned Russia for its grave breach of international law. So yes, international law had been breached by Russia, but there were actors that were willing to defend it against another powerful actor. So you've all heard about the sanctions that have been in place against Russia. It's quite significant that a country that's as, economically important within the world structure as Russia was placed under such heavy sanctions, right? And this was done for, the rules-based order, for, upholding the UN Charter, right? So that was basically a sense of revival for international lawyers. But then what happened was October 7, 2023, right? Hamas attacked Israel, took hostages back into the territory, and then Israel responded. And basically the extent of Israel's response to what happened in October 2023, at first there was all this discussions, if it's legal, if it's justified, so on and so forth. Now we've reached the point where the majority opinion, and maybe some people here don't agree with this, but is basically that Israel's response was disproportionate. You can disagree whether or not it was, it was right to respond, so on and so forth. But it's the level of damage that has been done to Gaza, has colleagues around me basically saying, is international law, does it even exist after what has happened in Gaza? And one of the main issues was this issue of double standards. And I remember, I don't know if anybody watched Matt Miller. So he was the press secretary for the White House, basically always being asked by reporters, well, you're condemning Russia for bombing a hospital, but Israel bombed a hospital. Do you condemn Israel? And then he would have this kind of awkward way of going around it. Basically, he was always put to reporters, well, this is happening in Russia, you're condemning it in Russia. It's happening in Gaza, Israel's doing this, you're not condemning Israel. So what started to happen was the actors that were so vehemently defending international law in Ukraine were not doing it for Gaza. And that's when people, I think, really started to feel, okay, we don't know if international law can survive this. And it wasn't only among international scholars, but it's also what credibility does the US or the EU have as defenders of international law amongst third states, right? So for third states that are being put under pressure for, you're not sanctioning Russia. Instead, you're buying gas from Russia that's allowing Russia to circumvent our sanctions. You should sanction Russia. Well, these third states say, well, why are we supposed to get on board with sanctioning Russia when you're not applying all your weight, to the situation that's going on here in Gaza? So it's not only the international system that was being undermined, the international order that's being undermined by what's going on in Gaza, but it's also the authority of these actors that we expect might uphold international law. So, and all this actually happened started to happen before Donald Trump entered into office. Because, for example, another issue of double standards was one I referred to earlier when there was the arrest warrant against Vladimir Putin and the arrest warrant against Benjamin Netanyahu. The states that said, yes, for sure, we will arrest Vladimir Putin if he enters our territory, when it came to arrest both our heads of states of a country that has not accepted the ICC. They said, yes, we'll arrest Putin. We won't arrest Benjamin Netanyahu because he's the head of state of Israel, which has not accepted the International Criminal Court's jurisdiction, and therefore he enjoys immunity. Meaning we will respect his immunity, we will respect Benjamin Netanyahu's immunity and not arrest him, but we will not do that for Russia. And, that's a clear double standard, like cases are not treated alike. And that already is just, another example of something, well, how can I take you too seriously? Yes? No, Russia is also not a party to the International Criminal Court. Yeah. I should have highlighted, yeah, so neither Russia or Israel are party. So that was, and all this, my point was that all this was happening before Donald Trump came into office. So the system was already under quite a bit of strain before President Trump came. And so I think it's the idea that Trump entered the international stage and it was like, well, he's not going to make it better. And then I started to wonder, it's like, well, we know that there's these issues, but how come we, and I say, my colleagues all of a sudden we were organizing events, there were papers being published, there were blog posts about, can the international system withstand another Trump presidency? And it's interesting because in his first presidency, he was doing quite a bit, let's say, to undermine the multilateral system, but there was this idea, there were even books published on it, that the system is strong enough to withhold a Trump presidency. So I was a bit curious, okay, how come? And I think it might be because we were feeling, well, there's already pressure points that are being applied, and Donald Trump might be, a drop in a glass that's already way too full. But I think there's something even more interesting about Donald Trump, is that he kind of says, before when I referred to the oil, he kind of says things that you don't really say. And an example of this is, back in, and I had to remember this happened, when Canada was concerned that, Trump was the US was gonna try to annex it and make Canada the 51st state. Well, what Donald Trump said, I'm sorry, there's long text, but he had this, so he said, if you look at a map, they drew an artificial line right through it between Canada and the US. Just a straight artificial line. Like somebody a long, long time ago, many decades ago. It makes no sense. So basically he was saying, well, it makes no sense. They just drew a line across the map and therefore there was Canada and there was the US. So for an international lawyer, it's like, well, yeah, but all lines on maps are artificial and somebody draws them. Basically, it's almost kind of absurd to the point where I can't take this seriously, right? And yet people were taking it seriously because, at the time there was, what's the Prime Minister of Canada, Carney? He was also able to, he was, conducting his campaign, I'm going to have a tough response to Trump. And he also had the same strange statement about Greenland. We were worried about whether or not he was going to reclaim Greenland because he liked the resources there. And he said, well, I don't know, said something along the lines of, well, somebody said they were Danish and they just took a boat and they went to Greenland and then they said, okay, Greenland is ours. I don't know if that's true or not. And it's kind of like this funny way of kind of like saying, well, no, we don't question state sovereignty because we question where the lines were drawn on a map. You know, there's a certain way that we have of presenting things. So I think Donald Trump, he doesn't follow what I would call the script that would kind of provide reassurance that, okay, he cares about international law and he cares about the international system. And I just want to give an example of a reassuring speech to an international lawyer. So this was one, I'm sorry, it's text again, which you probably, I'll read out the relevant parts for you. It was given by President Eisenhower, and he was basically talking about the Congolese independence, because at the time there was a civil war that was breaking out in Congo, and then there was concern, you know, about how things were going to go, if this was going to undermine Congo's independence. They were on the path towards independence. This is in 1960. And so in his statement, he refers to the African people's right to choose their own way of life and determine for themselves the course they choose to follow. So he makes a pledge to refrain from intervening in these new nations' internal affairs. So we will not intervene in Congo's internal affairs. We will respect their sovereignty. We will respect their self-determination. And if there's any disputes, we will settle them peacefully, and we will also refrain from any action to intensify or exploit present unsettling conditions in the Congo. We pledge to not send arms or forces in troubled areas, or by inciting leaders or people to violence against each other. I don't know if you saw this documentary called Soundtrack of a Coup d'etat. Has anybody seen this? Yeah. Sorry? Oh, what? Okay, yeah, so this is a speech that was, you know, shown in the documentary. What was actually happening? Does anybody want to say? Well, President Eisenhower is like, we pledge to respect. Yeah, so Mumba was killed by, you know, who? But what was the US doing is more my question. So they were involved in basically fomenting a civil war in Congo. Belgium was involved as well, because they wanted to maintain control over Congolese mines, especially in Katanga, where we can extract uranium. So I find it interesting that, you know, you have this speech that's given by President Eisenhower in the UN General Assembly, and he's saying exactly what we want to hear, what reassures us. And then this was in 1960, and then 60 years later, you open the archives, and then you find out all this stuff that was happening. And so with Donald Trump, it doesn't seem to be so much like we have to open the archives in 60 years. You know, maybe we just kind of have to open the newspaper, and then we are like, okay. So I think also it's a very uncomfortable feeling, because you're like, okay, international law seems to be out the window, but even when it was present, you know, what was it really so great, actually? And so that's why I think when I was researching this, I was wondering about this. Okay, what is it about, we all know that there's things that are imperfect in this world, right? But we kind of like say, well, it's okay. You know, we know it's there, but we kind of depend on it to feel good. And so I came across this theory. It's I'm not a social psychologist, by the way. If there's anybody who's a social psychologist in the room, I apologize. But okay, so basically I came across this theory, system justification theory. So it explains why individuals might justify or legitimize a system despite its flaws, and why they invoke arguments to kind of outweigh any shortcomings that it may have, right? So we might know that, I don't know, a certain economic system isn't great, that it creates inequality, but we might find ways to justify it. It's basically like, well, it's better than the alternative. It's the only good system we have, so on and so forth. And it generally comes from a feeling that we live in a status quo, right? We don't really have much say in the type of systems we live in. but we don't want to feel bad about we don't want to have this uncomfortable feeling that it's all, not really going well, or that there's injustice, or that there's inequality. So we find ways to reduce those negative feelings by coming up with means in which to justify the system that we live in. So it's a means through which we reduce uncertainty, and it also enables us to feel kind of in control of, our environment that we live in. And so I think international law has very much functioned this way for people like me who get a PhD in international law and who then, go to Utrecht to teach international law. Like, this is what I do on a daily basis, right? I stand in front of students and I tell them how good international law is. And so I need to somehow justify sometimes, things. They ask me a question and I'm like, oh gosh, how do I justify that? I know it's not great, but I have to justify it somehow, right? Because I need to feel good about the position I'm in, and also my students in the classroom. I mean, it's still early enough for them. It's early enough for me to tell them, don't do this, guys. But I can't do that. I don't know. I might get reported. Who knows? But anyway, so I think that basically for a lot of international lawyers, international law functions as a belief system that gives us the feeling that, okay, big political events that, important to us, that matter to us, they might be out of our control, but I have a sense of it's not maybe under my control, but it's under control because there's this thing called international law. And, I just have to improve the rules. I just have to be a really good advocate so that states will listen to me, whatever. There's different ways in which I can act in order to contribute to the goals of international law. So if anybody, that kind of, relying on systems to bring order into our otherwise chaotic world, that's referred as compensatory control, right? So I don't have control, but I compensate by relying on institutions, governmental structures, or religion in order to inject control. And so I think with Donald Trump, because, the script is out the window and he's presenting things in a very crude way, it's a bit of a shock to our system. And I think, if we have a sense that, all right, things aren't great, like I said, we knew with Gaza what's going on here, it's not great, and then Donald Trump comes, and then it's really like, whoa. Okay, I know things aren't great, Donald Trump isn't making them better. So, and then it's very easy, so again, we have this feeling of uncertainty, and so of course, we'll react very negatively to an individual, for example, that threatens our worldview or our feeling of being in control. So for me, that's kind of why, I'm not saying, of course, I'm not justifying Donald Trump, I'm not saying that I think he's really great for, whatever system we have. But I think that the advantage is that he's kind of, making us come to terms with these systemic inequalities or injustices that are embedded in our system, but which we can convene as international lawyers, because we don't usually like to get involved in politics, that we can conveniently kind of look away from because we just focus on the terminology of international law. And I think, Donald Trump, I came across this article, but it was almost 10 years ago, where Donald Trump is basically playing the role of the fool that performs a very important social function, forcing us to come to terms with our preconceptions and, to realize things or to become aware of things in our reality that might be escaping us or that we might not be willing to come to terms to. So I think ultimately, I don't think it's Donald Trump's intention, he might be doing this unintentionally, I would say. But, and again, this is me trying to give a positive spin on this Trump experience, but I think that ultimately if we can turn this into, okay, he's really made obvious the things in our system that are not working well, and we're really committed to making this a better and fairer system for all concerned, and Donald Trump is showing us, putting the finger on the wound, basically, showing us where it's not working, maybe. Because it's quite easy for states, for example, to withdraw from agreements. It's not, the climate change agreement isn't the only treaty where a state has withdrawn from, right? But it raised a lot of concern when Donald Trump did it. So I think it's, perhaps, what's the way forward? I don't know. but I think the first thing I always say, if we need to change something, it's always important to be aware, okay, what are the weaknesses? What is it we need to address? So basically, I think at the end of the day, Donald Trump can hopefully teach us a lesson, because if we don't get it from Donald Trump, we're going to have another one, right? And I don't think we want to repeat this class. So thank you all very much for your attention. And